Hello, thanks for joining us again. We're in First Corinthians 15 today, aren't we? Hello, thanks for joining us again. We're in First Corinthians 15 today, aren't we? We've talked about First Corinthians 15, 1 through 19. We've talked about First Corinthians 15, 20 through 34. And today we need to finish out the chapter. If you haven't watched those earlier parts, I'd recommend that you do. They're on the website, they're on YouTube, and you can go back and find those earlier installments. At least it was starting in chapter 10 anyway. And if you're following along with the workbook, which might be recommended as well, you can find it on my website, CADLeonard.com. So here we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We're picking up around 35. Paul has done this so far. In chapter 15, 1 through 11, he says the whole thing I'm about to talk to you about, the resurrection of the dead, is predicated upon the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And then he says, if you deny that business, that's a non-starter. But he says, but that's not the case with you. You do affirm the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And therefore, and he makes about, 5, 6, 7 points that come out of that, implied points. They don't buy into some of the points they're saying, but he says you need to go the full way with it. 1 Corinthians 15, about 12 through 19. When he gets down into 15:20, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20, he says, now let me talk to you about the whole overview, the whole worldview of humanity. It starts with Adam, who brought the curse. He lived in rebellion, but God sends Christ to patch it all up. And patch up is, it sounds like he just does a half so job. That's not the case. Jesus Christ fully redeems. And that's the point he aims at in 15. In contrast to Adam, here's the ideal human Jesus, who can be your representative too if you're represented in and by and through him. 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 28. Well, he does what's right by humanity, by his delegation. He delivers it right back up to the Father. And so he says, you too can be with Christ and be all in all with God, glorify God. 1 Corinthians 15, 28. Well, as he gets into 15:29, then he says one more argument before he gets into the final little bit here. And in 1 Corinthians 15:29, he says, just think about this. The fact that you're baptized, doesn't that say something about your believing in an afterlife? Life after the death? Life after death, doesn't that say something about that? In 15:30 and following, he says, and think about this, the fact that we spend our lives in jeopardy or in peril or in danger, doesn't that say something about our belief in an afterlife? After all, if there were no afterlife, why bother? And so he makes a couple of further arguments to try to further his point, which is this: there is an afterlife. And even though you say you don't necessarily believe in the right view of an afterlife, you got to accept it based on what you're doing, what your practice is. And so he's heaping the implications upon them. In 1 Corinthians 15:35, he starts to handle some of the questions or the objections that would probably, if not in actuality, be raised toward this notion of the resurrection of the body. And so one of them will say, 15:35, with what kind of body do they come? How are the dead raised? And Paul responds, I'm in 15:36 at this point. You fool, thou fool, that which you sow does not come to life, anastasis, resurrect. It doesn't come back from the dead unless it dies. And verse 37, that which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But 15:38, God gives it a body, just as he wished, and to each of the seeds a body of its own. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one flesh of men, and another flesh of beasts, and another flesh of birds, and another of fish. There are also, by the way, verse 40, heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one, and the glory of the earthly is another. Now, he says I'm around 1541. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for star differs from star in glory. And he's going to make this point. I suppose I should probably just go ahead and get right into it. This is 1542. So in that way, also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a perishable body, raised an imperishable body. Sown in dishonor, raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power. 44. Sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. More on that in a moment. If, verse 44, there's a natural body, also there's a spiritual body. That's Paul's argument. 15:45. So it's written, and he quotes, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. He's at Genesis 2:7 at this point. The last Adam, Christ, of course, became a life-giving spirit. On 46, the spiritual's not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. 47, the first man's from the earth, earthy. Second man, Christ, I think at this point, is from heaven. And he's showing how Christ is paradigmatic, emblematic, representative of us. That's his aim here. 48, as is the earthy, so also are those who are earthy. As is the heavenly, so also are those who are heavenly. Just as we have borne the image of the earthy, we will also bear the image of the heavenly. Okay, let's get back into 15:35. One of them, the Corinthian detractors, might have asked Paul, yeah, this business about bodily resurrection is questionable, to say the least. And they would say, so with what kind of body do they come? This resurrection body business, tell me a little bit more about it. Now, remember, when they say that kind of thing, they're denying the resurrection of the body. And Paul says, listen to this, fool. So you know he's being sharp. Suggests something about the question being raised out of a bad motive, bad agenda, not a loving, honest, sincere question. What kind of body do they come with, And Paul says, thou fool, you fool, how can something resurrect, come to life, except it first die? Now, here's the problem. A number of us have taken this view of a bodiless, eternal state of existence. We've taken this view that the spirit is eternal, the soul is eternal, which I believe, by the way. I would need to prove that. I have not done that yet. I don't even pretend I'm going to, but I'm suggesting I do believe that. We've taken this view that the soul or the spirit is eternal, and so the soul will live on, but the body will die and just be discarded. And so what the resurrection of the body amounts to, I've heard this from too many people not to say something about it, is just the soul will live on for eternity. Well, that's not resurrection. Look at 15:36. 15:36. That which you sow does not come to life. It cannot resurrect unless it first dies. Now, let me ask you this. Does the spirit die and come back to life? Does the soul die and come back to life? No. The only possibility that we have to fit the bill of resurrection is body. The body has to resurrect. And that is the template as set forth by the bodily resurrection of Jesus now, isn't it? You see, I'm one of those who thinks this. After the resurrection of Jesus, he's still human, but he is now the glorified human, which is why he can walk through walls. And I'm not saying that he couldn't have done that before. I'm saying that I think he passes into a new mode of existence. He was in a fleshly mode of existence. 1 Peter 3:18. Yes, look at 1 Peter 3:18 in your own time. But after the resurrection, the glorification of Jesus, he is now in a new mode of existence. He's not in fleshly existence any longer. He is in spirit, which is to say something about this new mode of existence, or this new world in which Jesus is, the human Jesus, I mean to say, is participant. You see, God, the Father, is living his life through the boy, the human Jesus of Nazareth. And in the human drama, the death, burial, resurrection, the glorification, I mean to say, the whole glorification, the resurrection, the whole deal, the whole Gethsemane experience leads Christ to exit this world, this mode of flesh, which he puts to death in his cross, and he enters into a new sphere or mode of existence termed spirit. 1 Peter 3:18, give it a look in your own time. 1 Peter 3:18. So in 1 Peter 15, when Jesus' resurrection is a bodily resurrection, it sets the stage for our resurrection. Somebody wants to question us on the resurrection, Paul says. Well, look at this, 15:36. If it doesn't die, it can't come back to life. You do away with the notion of a bodily resurrection, and you do away with the notion of resurrection at all, completely. We need to accept bodily resurrection. That's Paul's argument. Now, let's move into the workbook and see some of these things. Number 28, Some would ask or object to Paul's teaching on the bodily resurrection by raising issues of mechanics. That's your blank on 28, mechanics. The mechanics are tricky. And since they have some questions about the mechanics, they're using that as an attack against Paul's teaching itself. But what he does here, and we just read this, what he does here, number 29, is he responds in a number of different ways. But here's what he does. 29a, he illustrates. He illustrates. He's not as of yet, proving the notion of resurrection. In this instance, in this particular context, 35 and down to the bottom, he is not proving the notion of resurrection. Why? In some ways, maybe though not all, but in some ways he feels like he's already done that. The resurrection of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through about 19 with the argumentation that follows. So he feels like he's already argued his case on the reality of the resurrection. What he's doing now is something else. He's not arguing that it's a reality. He's illustrating it as to answer their objections or questions. Like a child might have some questions about some things. You've already proven your point, but now you need to make it make sense. And so you use an illustration or an analogy. You're not now arguing the reality or the proof of it. You're now just simply relating some of the difficulties or some of the hangups that they might be having. Well, in this case, that's what Paul does. He illustrates different aspects of what is a revelational truth, resurrection of the dead, which is a revelation fact. You don't believe in the resurrection apart from the holy text, you understand? You'd never look at trees, rocks, plants and say, I think there's going to be one day a grand resurrection, life from the dead for all of human beings. That doesn't happen. Resurrection is a revealed truth. Now, we need to prove the holy text is legitimate and to be taken seriously. But you don't derive resurrection from the rocks, flowers, grass, and trees. Too many people have tried to make naturalistic arguments for theological or revelation realities. That won't go in some cases. Some things we can get from nature, but some things we cannot. Revelation tells us about the resurrection of the dead. Apart from revelation, we'd have no notion of it. And so what Paul's doing is he's illustrating, this is 29a, he is illustrating aspects of the resurrection that he's already proven. He is illustrating. 29b, he shows that God is able to raise life. You think it's a problem, he says, that there's a seed that dies? Well, God can bring it back to life. You think it's a problem that there's a body that's, you fill in the blanks, decayed, decomposed? You think it's a problem for God? Remember what Abraham said, Hebrews 11, he knew that God could bring Isaac back from the dead. Hebrews 11, I'm around 17 through 22 at that point. Hebrews 11, 17 through 22. It's not a problem for God. He can raise life from the dead. That's part of what Paul's saying. 29c, he shows that God can invent based on the need. God can invent based on the need. He's that brilliant. He's created an atmosphere here in fleshly mode of existence. And so he says, if Drew is going to be a personality in the fleshly mode of existence, I need to give him a body suited for that mode of existence, suited for that world. So he gives me a body that is natural. Listen to this. It is natural, which is to say it's suited for the natural world. It's not telling me about the stuff it's made of. When it says natural, he's not talking about skin. He's not talking about bones. He's not talking about teeth. He's not talking about eyes, hair, etc., etc., etc. He is talking about the world or the existence for which the body is suited. God can invent based on that need. Well, what about cosmology? Can God create the sun, moon, and stars? That's what he says. Can God create fish with gills to swim in the seas? Birds with wings to fly in the skies? That's what he's arguing in 15 down from about 37 through 41. God can invent based on the need, the sphere, the mode of existence. And he can do it with the resurrection of the body too. That's where he's headed. But he's illustrating that God has power, not only in ability to create life from the dead, but he has the ability to invent based on the need. Number 29d, God can create variations or differences. Here's how it is. Some of us are short and some of us are tall. Some of us are skinny. Some of us are a little more on the plump side. Some of us are good looking. Some of us are uglier, just to put it in. And when I use that word ugly, by the way, I'm using it as the world would have it. Whatever. I could say more about that. Anyway, God creates us with variations slash differences. But he creates those differences in connection with some of the points we've already raised based on the need. Now, you may be one of those persons who's a shorter, plump, uglier fellow, and you may feel like, well, what's the need for me to be created this way? That needs to be worked out in some other contexts, I think. But do you think that maybe there is one? Do you think that God's really that concerned with physical appearance? Do you think that God, in creating the variations or the differences between different people, do you think that maybe he sees a need for us to be different people, but we're all still human? I think God's concern is different than what the world has placed emphasis on. The world popularizes the movie stars and the good-looking people and makes this the end of it all. This is what it means to be successful in this world. And I think God's wrecking that whole system, showing us that there's more to being genuinely human than having money, having status, having good looks. God is saying there's more to this human thing. And after all, I think if we read maybe Isaiah 53 too has something to say about the boy Jesus of Nazareth, that when he showed up, he wouldn't be something we'd ooh and ah after, in his appearance, that is. He'd look the part of a humble person. And I wonder if God's not telling us something there too. God can accomplish his mission with little people, with humble people. And I wonder if Paul's not making that point in 1 Corinthians 15 as well. All of these differences, all of these variations, God's able to create them, but there's also a purpose to them. Do you think you've got purpose with Christ? You think that you can anticipate the resurrection of the dead? I think you can. 29E, God can appropriate. God can appropriate the glory or the body for the need or the environment. That's similar, but there's a little bit of a different point that I'm aiming at there. But God can appropriate. It's similar to the point on 29B and C. He's able to raise life. He's able to invent based on the need. But God can appropriate it. That is, God, even upon creating a body, a human body, he can rework some things and gear it for the next world. And that's what he does in the resurrection. We're going to read this word change down in 1 Corinthians 15. Whether or not you die and resurrect, we will all be changed, Paul said. 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 50. Go through 55. 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 55. There will be a change. And God can appropriate what he gave us for the next world. He can invent, he can raise. All of that is what Paul's getting at in 15, 37 through 41. Now, let's get some of these next blanks. Number 30, Paul's sharpness. When he says, thou fool, that which you sow can't come to life, resurrect, except it first die, shows the bad spirit and the bad assumptions by his objectors. It shows the bad spirit, number 30, and the bad assumptions. Now, here's this crew at Corinth, and they strut their stuff, and they come into church and they say, well, we're the big hitters here. And Paul says, but the problem, first of all, is you've got a bad agenda with your questions. And the second problem is you're assuming things that aren't legitimate. You're assuming that the bodily resurrection is inherently flawed. But Paul says, here's the flaw. How can something come to life except to first die? Suggesting that probably they believed in some view of an afterlife, but they discarded the notion of a resurrected body. So I think here's what they went around saying. We believe in the resurrection. We believe in some kind of afterlife. We believe in a resurrection. But then Paul's hitting them with this. If you believe in resurrection, what's resurrecting? Something has to be coming back to life. Not the soul, not the spirit. Do we have an entity that can come back to life, resurrect? And the only argument we can make at this point is it's got to be the body. And I think that the Corinthian detractors were saying, we believe in resurrection. We believe in natural life. It's just not the same as you, Paul. We believe in the eternality of the soul. That'd be very Greco-Roman of them, wouldn't it? Fits the Corinth context. But I think Paul's saying, but then you don't have resurrection. You don't see it, but you've denied the resurrection. And therefore, based on your argumentation, denying this body coming back from the dead, though it needs to be changed, he's going to say that here in a second. But you deny that this body comes back from the dead, and you deny Jesus' resurrection. You don't realize that's where you've gone with all of this, but that's where you've gone, he says. Oh, it's a problematic view, isn't it? Number 30, the resurrected entity had to die first. Had to die first. There's a view out there called hyperpreterism. I don't think we intended it to be a slur, but we used the words AD 70 theology, and it came off to that crew as a slur. I think they're ultra sensitive. I think they get sore about every little attack they get their way, but they'll ravage people. This view, hyperpreterism, AD 70 theology, suggests some bizarre stuff. I've done a little book on it. You can find it on my website, cadleonard.com/books. And I can't remember, maybe 150 to 180 page thing. It's a little thing. And it critiques their view pretty hard. They don't know what they're doing with the resurrection of the dead, and they don't know what they're doing with the biblical text, and they certainly don't know what they're doing with 1 Corinthians 15. I'd like to say a word about that. I'd go too far afield and waste too much time. If you're interested in that view, especially as it pertains to 1 Corinthians 15, get my little thing on hyperpreterism, AD 70, taking a look at hyperpreterism, and you might find it useful. If you don't, shoot me a line. If you do find it helpful, shoot me a line. drewleonard@live.com. Okay, we're in 1 Corinthians 15. And number 31, Paul's illustration from the seed, he talks about that in verses 37, 38. The seed serves the purpose to expose the weakness of the critic's position. That's what he's doing. All he's showing is that they've come up with some counter arguments. The seed shows them that that's not exactly right. They don't know what they're talking about. And even in just observing nature, we can see that their position fails. He's not saying that the seed is exactly parallel to the resurrection of the body. All he's showing is an illustration to show that their objection falls flat on its face. And then there's a technical argument. I've got it in the workbook there. You'll notice that in the Greek text, that word bear, grain, bear, 1537, bear is the same word as naked in 2 Corinthians 5, 3 and 4, where Paul's talking about the resurrection of the body. For 2 Corinthians 5, 3 and 4, he calls it, we don't want to be found naked or bare. He's using the same terminology in the Greek text as he is in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, take a look at 32. Paul makes the point that all of the bodies created by God are suited for their right environments. There's your next blank on 32. God suits the bodies for their right environments. He talks about sun, he talks about the moon, talks about the stars. And then we've got this on 32. The heavenly bodies might refer to bodies of angels. Not exactly sure, but he talks about the heavenly bodies. Verse 40. Maybe bodies of angels. And I've got some passages there. Matthew 22:30, Romans 2 and verse 7. Maybe. All right. Now we've read this. We read 42 through 49. Let's unpack what Paul's doing here now. Notice the contrast. If you've got the workbook, this little chart that I've got, it's a kind of like a T chart. It shows the contrast that he's making, the comparison and the contrast that he's making between the body and the resurrected body. And so on the one side, I've got, it is sown, and all of this is right out of the text, by the way. But the body, the the natural body, and we'll talk about that here in a second, is sown as a perishable, dishonor, weakness, natural body. That's the one side of the chart. He says this, and he sets it up, compare and contrast. He says, it is 42, sown perishable, raised imperishable, sown in dishonor, sown in weakness, sown in natural body. On the other hand, he sets all of that over against this. The resurrected or raised body is raised or resurrected imperishable. in glory, in power, a spiritual body. Now, if you do the linguistics thing and you look at the syntax in the Greek text, you can find several similarities in 1 Corinthians 15 with Paul's discussion in Romans 8 and 2 Corinthians 5. I know that we're right to see these three texts as saying different but quite similar things. They're all talking, though they bring different things to the table in some of these cases. They often say the same thing in many ways. They often say similar things in many ways. In these three chapters, 1 Corinthians 15, 2 Corinthians 5, and Romans 8, Paul consistently is talking about the resurrection of the body, the final consummate stage of where this whole thing heads for humanity. And so, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, talking about the resurrection of the body, we need to now wrangle with this question of what he means when he talks about the contrast, the natural body, the spiritual body. Let's look at this. 15:44. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there's a natural, there's also a spiritual. All right, what does he mean? This is number 34 in the workbook. The words natural and spiritual do not tell the what or the substance of the body. It doesn't tell us this kind of stuff. When he uses the words natural and spiritual, he's telling us not about the what, the substance of the body, but the where it's suited for. He is talking to us about the environment for which that body is geared. A spiritual body, whatever that might look like, he doesn't give us a whole lot of detail, but he's going to tell us a little bit more about it here in just a second. But a spiritual body wouldn't necessarily fit the bill for planet Earth now, would it? A purely spiritual body wouldn't need food, drink, sexual fulfillment, shelter, etc., etc., etc. A purely spiritual body would be quite radically different from the needs, the environment of this material mode of existence. Now, here's the thing. The material mode of existence, needing all of that, food, drink, sexual fulfillment, shelter, etc., really doesn't have a business in the spiritual mode of existence now, does it? Too many places where Paul says some similar things like that. This doesn't really jive with that. Now, here's the interesting thing. We have the spiritual world mode of existence and the natural world mode of existence interlocking or intersecting in some ways, though not all, in Jesus of Nazareth. Following his resurrection, I said a bit about this a moment ago, following his glorification, his resurrection, what happens is the Jesus who is still on planet Earth for about 50 more days, Acts chapter 1, he's still on earth for about 50 more days after his glorification. We see him interweaving between the material mode of existence, natural mode of existence, and the spiritual mode of existence. We never get a definition of now Jesus' body taking on new DNA or new molecules or atoms. It's not a new body in that sense, you see. If you had put Jesus, even after the glorification, I'm convinced, if you had put Jesus' hand under the microscope, it would have looked just like another human being's hand, minus the holes. You understand? If you had done a scan on Jesus' DNA, you had checked his DNA, you had evaluated what he's made of, it would have still said, oh, he's human. But he's exiting at this point the fleshly mode of existence. He is choosing, having become the glorified human, to still work in this mode of existence. But he's quickly going to ascend to the Father, and he's going to exit the material, fleshly mode of existence altogether. But following the glorification on earth, we see him as the glorified human intersecting with a pre-glorification state in many ways. And so we see an intersection of the worlds, and we're still in it right now, I'm convinced. It's tough for me to take that view, the 80-70 view that says we're not. You understand? The chaos, the decay, the grief, the sorrow, it's still here with us. It's still here with us. You mean to tell me this is already the post-glorification state? Can't get on board with the view for a trillion reasons. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing. Jesus, in being here after the glorification, can say to those who are in him, and he says this even in the holy text after he ascends to the Father, he says, in me you've been justified. In me you've been adopted. In me you've been glorified. But while he says all of that, you already have been this, he'll turn right around in Paul and say, oh, but you still need to be justified. Romans 2:13. Oh, yes, it does say that. You still need to be justified. Even the justified ones need to still be justified, as if it's a futuristic thing. Yeah, that's what it says. Glorified. You will be glorified. Look at Romans 8 in your own time. Romans 8 and 9. You will be adopted. Romans 8:23. That's what it says. How can he say you have been justified, glorified, adopted, and then he'll turn right around and say you will be glorified, justified, and adopted? Which one is it? And that's part of, it's not necessarily a dichotomy that makes a contradiction. It's an already but not yet. In Jesus Christ as our representative, we've been justified, we've been glorified, we've been adopted. But the consummation beyond a mere representation in Jesus Christ, our actuality is coming. The consummation of that is coming at a future day. And that's part of Paul's argument when he says in Romans 4:17, he can call things that haven't even happened yet as though they were. He says something similar like that in Hebrews chapter 11. What's the point? What's the point? It doesn't make it any less sure. If you're in Christ now, you've been glorified, you've been justified, you've been adopted as sons. But there's a coming day based on that assurance where the bodily resurrection commences, and it's the consummation of it all. After all, though we've been glorified, justified, adopted now, don't you still feel the pain when you hit your hand? Don't you still feel the pain when that body of yours wears out? You start to suffer cancer. And don't you suffer pain when you lose a loved one? Can't stomach the view that says we're already in the resurrection. Can't stomach the view that says we're already at the consummation of our glorification, justification, adoption. There's more to this story yet. And Paul's telling us, Jesus is telling us, it's yet to come. The big part of the story that's happened is this. Jesus Christ has done his work. And there's assurance in Jesus Christ. But it's the fact that we're in him that bases our hope on something more yet to come. The end of the story is not grief and sorrow and chaos and decay, folks. The end of the story is glorification and a resurrected, a fully consummated view of a resurrection of a body where we spend eternity with the loving, holy Father. 1 Corinthians 15 is aiming at part of that. Back to 15:44. What's Paul saying? 15:44. When he says the body, is initially sown a natural body, he says we got bodies that are geared for this mode of existence. He's not telling us the substance of what the body's made for. He's telling us the where. It is raised for a new mode of existence, a new world. He's telling us the where. That's your blanks on number 34. The what and then the where. We have this view, and this is what Corinth's getting close to saying if they're not saying exactly this. Thinking that the resurrection of the body is some kind of soul. I think the soul's involved. Don't misunderstand me. But when the resurrection of the body is being discussed, Paul is actually rebutting this idea that it's just the soul. You don't have resurrection, he says. But there's more. We sometimes get this idea then that the soul will live on in eternity as some kind of like cobweb, ghastly element. That's not right either. And we get this idea, well, that's spirit, substance. Paul's not talking about spirit substance, is my point. Paul is talking about the spiritual mode of existence, a spiritual world. And he says we can be part of it. And he says that the body will be raised, suited for it. Is that what he says? That's what he says. 1 Corinthians 15 now, we move into 45 and following, which we've already read. Let's get the blanks on 35. In Genesis 2:7, Paul uses that text to quote, Adam was life-receiving God. This is 46 of 1 Corinthians, 46. I'm wrong. 1 Corinthians 15:45. The first man, Adam, became a living soul. He received a soul from God. He was life-receiving. But in 45, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. And there's your next blank on 35. Jesus was and is life-giving. Different. Adam received life. Christ came and gave it. And there's the difference that he's setting up. 36. Even the saints experience the natural world. Loss, grief, death, etc. 46 says as much. The spiritual's not first, but the natural. You and I have participated in that. We are in it right now. Now, maybe we've started to make our way into the fully consummate spiritual world, but we're not there yet. We're not yet there yet. We are living, as one said, life between the ages, the old Adamic age of rebellion and the new age of Christ. Christ came and there for a time was sandwiched right in the middle where they were intersecting, and he's put us right there too. There's coming a day at the second coming, so says 15, 23, and 24, when all of this human drama will end. Christ will take his delegation in fullness and deliver it right back up to the Father. And guess what? That's the end of the story. God's all in all, 15:28. And we get to be part of it. And we're in the final chapter of the story right now, but the chapter of the story that we're in, the final chapter, hasn't closed yet. We're not yet to the end of the book. We're in the final chapter, but we're not yet to the end of the book. When that page is turned and we're at the final page and we read the last words, it ends with us going to glory for all of eternity. We're in consummation with God the Father. The bodily resurrection's there. It's all set right. There's no more curse. There's no more grief. There's no more chaos, no more decay, no more sorrow. That's what the end of the story looks like. But right now, we're participating in this life between the worlds. We're in the natural world right now still, aren't we? But we're seeing shades of the inbreaking dominion of Christ, which came in his cross and will fully be consummated at the bodily resurrection. We're in the final chapter. We too, saints, experience the natural world. Number 37, Jesus is called the man from heaven, probably riffing on Daniel 7:13, where the Son of Man comes surfing in on the clouds to the Ancient of Days. Christ is the man from heaven. Now, in number 38, humanity is represented by both Adam and Jesus in two different senses. Both Adam and Jesus represent humanity, you understand? But Adam represents humanity in all of its fallenness, its rebellion. Jesus, on the other hand, represents humanity in her ideal state, pardon me. The way that humanity should have been done as the image of God, being genuinely human. Number 39, a possible alternate reading might push us to read, let us also bear the image of the heavenly, in which case Paul might be, number 39, exhorting us to see Jesus as the source and reason, as set over against Greco-Roman philosophy, values, etc. Maybe Paul's exhorting. So on 49, look at 15:49 again. We will also bear the image of the heavenly. That could be his point. It could be a statement of fact. We will do this. You're Christian, you're in Christ, you're glorified. This is the end of the thing. That could be what he's saying. But it could be a call to the Corinthians who are deeply intrigued by Greco-Roman values and tempted to go that way. It could be more than just a, we will do this. It could be a, let us do this. And if it reads as, look at 49 again, let us bear the image of the heavenly, he's calling them to action now. Stop acting like the old Adamic nature. Stop acting like the old Adamic way. I mean to say, I don't mean something like inherited sin or anything. Stop acting like Adam's rebellion. Stop acting like Adam and start acting like the image of the heavenly is what I'm getting at. 15:49. Maybe that's the reading we ought to take. Tough to say. I have no clue about the actual. Anyway, I'm diverging, aren't I? Okay. Let's move into 15 now. 50 through 58. 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 58. So the body's going to be raised. Do we have a little bit more of that, Paul? And what about this? What about those people who don't die? What about those? When Christ comes in the clouds and takes the saved home, what about Billy, who didn't even die? He was standing here alive when Christ came. That's a question that he seeks to address here in a little bit. And so in 1550, look at this, 1 Corinthians 1550. Now I say this, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Maybe that'll even make us rethink the way we do church sometimes. Nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, 51, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. Okay, that makes sense. So even if you're alive, you don't necessarily need to get the resurrection, life from the dead. You never died. But you do need a change to suit your body for the next world. Everybody's going to be changed, Paul says. 52, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. 53. This perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. But, 54, when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, and this mortal body will have put on immortality as a clothing, as a new garment, a new robe. This body is going to get a change. It's going to get a new garment, he says. Then, 54, will come about the saying that is written. And he quotes Isaiah 25 and conflates it with Hosea 13:14. Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? 56. The sting of death is sin. The power of sin is the law. 57 is the law. 57. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory. He's kind of riffing on that word victory now, isn't he? 57. Thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, 58, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord. And that's the end of the story about resurrection. Okay, here we are. 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 58. Let's get the workbook. Number 40, verse 50 illustrates that a change is needed to inhabit the next world. You need a change. This body's not geared for the next world. It's not suited for that environment. You got to be suited or geared for the spiritual mode of existence. That's his point. Verse 40, number 41. It is clear that it is the body, the corruptible body, that needs a change. The soul does not need a change to inhabit the next world. Think about that. Number 41. When he says on 1 Corinthians 15 that the perishable, 53, must put on the imperishable, the soul isn't perishable now, is it? It's not the soul that needs a new clothing. It's already geared for the next world. What needs a change suitable for the next world? It's the body. It's the body. You can't have a bodiless, eternal mode of existence. So says 1 Corinthians 15. And if you were to say that sort of thing, you're denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus. That's his argument. That is his argument in 1 Corinthians. All of this stems out of the resurrection of Jesus. That's the heart of Christianity. The death, yes, the death, and the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus is the heart of Christianity. The word of the cross teaches us how to reread everything in life. And the resurrection teaches us about the way to reread the end of the story about everything in life. This is more than just an event. It is an event. It is an historical event, but it's more than an event. You see this? Listen, the death and resurrection of Jesus is more than an event. It's more than just an historical event, which I believe in the historicity of this. Of course I do. But listen to me. The death and resurrection of Jesus is more than just an historical event. It's a worldview. It is a worldview. Jesus Christ comes into the world and teaches us about our origins. Jesus Christ comes into the world and teaches us by his death what we're to be about while we are here. Death to self, sacrifice for others, love in all circumstances. And then the resurrection teaches us where we're going. You've got three questions that really matter in this world. This is a worldview. Where did you come from? What are you doing while you're here? And where are you going? And Jesus Christ, in his life, death, burial, resurrection, addresses all of that. He says that he was a living soul. He brings life to all of us. He's showing us worldview. He's showing us what we're about while we're here in the fact that he lives a life and dies the death of the cross selflessly, sacrificially, lovingly. And then he shows us where we're going. He's raised from the dead. And in the supper, we are not just saying, for pity's sake, we're not just saying it. We're not just reciting it. We're not just rotely or ritualistically muttering the words. We are proclaiming, 1 Corinthians 11:26, the Lord's death until he come. 1 Corinthians 11:26. Jesus Christ in his life, death, burial, resurrection is showing us a worldview. He is showing us where we came from. He is showing us what we're doing while we're here, and he is showing us where we are going. It ends with consummation of the resurrection of the body, complete glorification, complete salvation, complete justification, complete adoption with the Father for eternity. And in 15, it's not just a soul that lingers on, it's the body. It's the body. God's taking us full circle. And the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus is more than just a fact. It is a fact, but it's a worldview. It shapes us into being like God as he revealed himself in the person Jesus of Nazareth. John 1:18. He, Jesus, has explained, exegeted, revealed. There's another word that it's slipping my mind. He has declared him. John 1:18. That's the aim of the whole holy text. Here is God in Jesus being a man, and he is calling on us to reshape who we are like God being a man in Jesus. My, isn't that call high? Isn't that call absurd? Isn't it impossible? This is the God who is calling people like you and me to do the impossible. But would we expect any less? This God is not going to come and give us just a health, wealth gospel. He's more noble than that, folks. He's more noble than that. He didn't come to just fix up all of our little problems and raise our bank accounts and give us a big feast for food and make sure that our houses are bigger and our roofs don't leak and that the coffee's always warm. That's not the God we serve. And thank God that he gives us those things, but that is not what this thing is about. In 1 Corinthians 15, we're seeing just another text that tells us about who God was in Jesus, what he's called on us to be, and he's telling us where the end of the story goes. We need to commit to the impossible in being noble people who love God and go the distance for the human family. That's what he's calling on us to be. Yeah, that is. It certainly is. 1 Corinthians 15, let's get back to it before I go any further. This is number 42. The trumpet is a figure. I can't help myself. Every once in a while I get preachy. 1 Corinthians 15, number 42 in the workbook. The trumpet's a figure out of Old Testament context. I don't think, I'm one of those, I could be wrong, but I don't think that we're going to literally hear the sound of a trumpet at the second coming of Christ. I think it's a metaphor. I think it's an illustration. I think it's a figure of speech. He is using Old Testament imagery where they did have a literal sound of a trumpet in the battle when God would judge nations. And he uses that imagery, that apocalyptic imagery to say, second coming, judgment scene, here it is. You're going to hear the sound of the trumpet. Probably just a figure as in judgment context. Number 43, the discussion of the perishable, mortal, and corruptible body and its change is quite similar to other texts by Paul. Romans 8, 2 Corinthians 5. Number 44, Paul quotes both Isaiah 25 verse 8 and Hosea 13:14 to say that death will be handled and that the end result is victory. Now, let me say something about this. I need to say something about this. There is a common push right now in the academic circles, Old Testament scholars, New Testament scholars. Uh, the scholars, by the way, I don't mean to knock all of them, but a good number of them don't have a clue what they're talking about. Does that make me arrogant? I don't know. Do your reading. If you read enough, you'll see that they don't have a clue what they're talking about in many cases, though not all. Sometimes the scholars are so committed to the academy and they're so entrenched in nonsense that they can't even give Paul or Jesus or anybody the benefit of the doubt anymore. Every time they read the text, it's just another proof that the Bible's not right. Who are these scholars again? Scholars that don't believe in the Bible teaching us about the Bible? What a bunch of nonsense. Well, listen to this. Listen to this. There's been a common push in the last, maybe 150, 200 years, wherever we read the Bible to say, oh, the Old Testament got it wrong factually. Oh, the New Testament got it wrong historically, archaeologically. And then we get to 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul quotes the Old Testament. 15:54. You might have a cross-reference in your Bible. 1 Corinthians 15:54. He is quoting Isaiah 25:8. And in the very next breath, he's quoting Hosea 13:14. And he sandwiches these two together. He mashes them up. Now, the common push has been this. Well, Paul, doesn't understand the context in Isaiah. He doesn't understand the context in Hosea, and he's misreading the Old Testament. He's plagiarizing, but not only is he plagiarizing, they accuse him of, they say he is actually misrepresenting the Old Testament text, and therefore Paul's to be vilified, I should say. And Paul just doesn't know what he's doing. He's not a good theologian. He's not a good Old Testament reader, and so Paul's not actually as smart as some of us think he is. That's the view. That's the view. I can't get on board with that. Everything we know about Paul suggests he was a very good reader of the Old Testament. He knew his facts. He knew his stuff. Isn't that what you get out of Acts? Isn't that what you get out of reading your New Testament, that he knew his Old? I can't help but see it that way. Now listen to this. The slur or the attack, the challenge against Paul that he is misreading the Old Testament, doesn't know what he's doing with these contexts like Hosea and Isaiah. Is that actually legitimate? I can't get on board with the view. Here's the thing. Let me tell you quickly about the situation in Isaiah and Hosea. In both of those 8th century BC prophets, they're up against the wall with the Assyrian crisis. Yeah, they are. The Assyrians are going to march in and level them, take them off into captivity. And it turns in quickly to the Babylonian crisis, culminating in 586 BC with the destruction of the temple. Do you think Paul knew that Isaiah and Hosea were working out of the Assyrian crisis there? I think he knew it. The contexts are almost too clear. Paul doesn't think that Hosea and Isaiah are talking about his own day. No. What Paul does is he sees the Assyrian shadow overtaking the land, and he writes across it, death. That's what it looked like. And when Paul reads Isaiah, and he hears Isaiah saying, in reference to the Assyrian shadow of death, Assyria, is going to be swallowed up in victory. Paul says, isn't that something? God can best Assyria. Paul reads Hosea 13. Swallowed up in victory. There's a little bit of an adaptation. He's morphing the text of Isaiah and Hosea a little bit to create this word victory and put some emphasis on it. Paul is definitely morphing the Old Testament text, so don't think that I'm unaware of that. But Paul reads Hosea 13 and he says, swallowed up life. God can best death bringing Assyria with life. God is the life giver. And you know what Paul does? He sees Assyria as a template or a model, a representative, a personification of death. And so he knows, I'm sure he knows, that Isaiah and Hosea are pronouncing life after the Assyrian crisis. But Paul takes the timeless redemptive truth that God can take death and bring life, and he refits that as a model or a proof case. He lifts it out of its context with Assyria and suits it to the resurrection of the body. If God brings life after the Assyrian crisis, what do you think he's going to do with this chaotic body that's rusting and decaying? That's the point he aims at in 1 Corinthians 15, 54, and 55. Paul doesn't miss the context. He uses the context as a prototype, as a model to say, I actually do know my Old Testament. God brought life out of death now, didn't he? And he says now in 1 Corinthians 15, what do you think he's going to do with us? He's going to bring, here's his key word that he's riffing on, victory. 1 Corinthians 15, 54, death swallowed up by victory. 55, death, where is your victory? Hosea 13, 14. And then 1557, victory is in Christ Jesus our Lord. You think God redeemed them from Assyria? Wait till you see what he does next. That's what he says. Wait till you see what he did in Jesus. Wait till you see what he does with us. You know what that Greek word victory is for victory is? It's that word Nike. Oh, the athletes wear it on the headbands, wear it on the shirt, wear it on the wristbands, and the tennis stars and the baseball players, they wear Nike. Nike in the Greek. Same spelling. What's the word mean? Victory, triumph, triumph. And Paul says, you think death brings victory? Where is it? You think death has the final say? Give it a second look. Look at what happened to Assyria. Death bringing Assyria. Where are they now? We haven't heard about Assyria in a good number of years. He says, you want to hear about victory? Look at the cross and look at the bodily resurrection of Jesus and look at what it means for people like you and me. Victory, victory. Here's our blanks on number 44. The end result is victory. And then I'll just quickly pass over this because I made the point ad nauseum back in 15, 3, and 4. I think he's quoting Hosea again here, you see. I think again on 15, 3, and 4, the third day reference, probably Hosea. And Paul is using this model that he sandwiched around all of 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4, 1 Corinthians 15, 55. Hosea wraps itself around the entire 1 Corinthians 15 discourse to say God has brought victory, life out of death before. With Assyria, he'll do it again with you. He's done it in Jesus. And that's his point. All of this is sandwiched up together, wrapped in together. And what Paul says is, these are not actually three different redemptions of God. One redemption, three different cases. God redeems from death. He rescued them out of Assyria's hand. He rescued Jesus out of death. He'll rescue us. Same rescuing, redemptive God. Three different cases of the same redemption with God. Next blank on 44, he applies it to the body. He applies the redemptive truth, the timeless, redemptive, rescuing truth about God. He applies it to the body. And Paul probably uses Hosea to create an inclusio as a prototype for the resurrection. All right, then 1556. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. You have three elements: death, sin, law. Wish I could say more on that. We really need to get into Romans at that point and talk about some of those things: sin, death, law. Don't have time for that, of course. Number 45, the triad might have been noticed by Paul in Genesis. These are elements of the old Adamic world. Death is the result of sinfulness. Sinfulness is a number of things. It is transgression of the law, so says the text explicitly, 1 John 3, 4. The master, however, went further than that, though. Now, didn't he? In Matthew 15, 18 through 20, he said sin wasn't just a transgression of the law. It is that: adultery, lying, theft, murder, etc. Sin, he said, began in the heart. Contamination begins in the heart. Did you know you and I can sin while doing mechanical behaviors that are absolutely right? Starts in the heart now, doesn't it? We can sin and be full of rot, doing things that are neutral or right, if our hearts aren't right. What's Paul aiming at here? Look at this in 1556. The sting of death. Where does death come from? Sinfulness. What is sinfulness? Transgression of the law, but it's also failure to be genuinely human. Failure for us to live up to all that God called us to be in the image of God. Failure to get our hearts right. God's calling us to more than just a mechanical reading, some ritualistic reading of the law. Sin brings about death. Now, where does sin come from? Law. The law. Now, think about that. Think about that. The law, that's where it comes from? Hmm. The law was given as a provision to reduce sin, but it's also a killer based on the way they responded to it. When you honor the law, it's a life-giving thing, and it was generated to give life. But guess what happened? We broke it, and it killed us. Number 45, noticed by Paul in Genesis. Number 46, the victory is won and given to us. It was not earned. Thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Gives us. It was given. It was won for us by Jesus, but given to us by God. Given to us by Christ. Not earned. It was not earned. And then number 47, this is coming off of 58. Paul concludes that the bodily resurrection is real, and he reverses the status of verses 2, 12 to 19, 30 to 34, and concludes that faith or labor is not in vain. Think about it. Earlier, he said this, bodily resurrection is not real. Everything you're doing is in vain. He reminds us at the end of the chapter, it is not. It is not in vain. There is a real bodily resurrection. And what Paul does is he brackets the entire book of 1 Corinthians with the cross, chapters 1, really, chapter 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. But chapter 1, he starts off really with the word of the cross, and he closes the book with the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15 tells us about where we're headed, folks. It's all predicated upon Jesus. He really did rise bodily. It's a historical fact, but it's more than that. It's a worldview. Thanks be to God, he gives us the victory in Jesus Christ our Lord.